yoga.
Well, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, on that note, just welcome. We will let people trickle in because we were taking from the time of Professor Fromherz, and we are really delighted to host here today. And these are being recorded. We will be, there will be these presentations then put on Roshan website, so it makes it possible for people to be later on able to make use of it. So, since this is an Esanyar Shater series, I would like to say a few words about him. Actually, he funded this series of presentations um, a long time ago before, with the establishment of Persian program. And when I joined Roshan Institute as director, these were already there. Of course, we have another very distinguished series of named after Professor Mir Jalali, who has funded that for us. So we're lucky to be able to get some of the best speakers in town. But a few words about Professor Yarshater. So he um, was born in 1920 and actually lived for 98 years. And for much of that time, he was a very active scholar and involved. I myself heard him speak in his 95th birthday. And not only he didn't need support of any kind, he had to be stopped because he was going over time, but actually with the level of energy and contribution was fascinating. Well, as you know, the breadth of what he did was really encyclopedic. Um, he was a historian and a linguist and focused heavily on ancient Iran and to the last day, regardless of all the upheavals that happened in his lifetime in Iran and the fact that he spent the rest of his life here outside Iran, he remained completely loyal to the scholarship that he was doing and established really the um, Persian studies in earnest in Columbia University. Um, of course, he has a lot on his CV, but we have to definitely make mention Encyclopedia Iranica, um, which brought over 300 authors together to produce multiple essays for it. And he also edited a volume of the Cambridge History of Iran. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the third volume that he edited. And he also had multiple awards from UNESCO, from various universities, and um, basically was recognized as the um, figure in establishing the presence of the ancient study of ancient Iran and languages on the agenda of the universities. So with that in mind, we are lucky to have access to a wonderful speaker today, Professor Fromherz, Allen Fromherz. My colleague Marjan is going to introduce him properly as he should be, even though his CV is also really complex and large enough that we won't be fitting it all in today. But I believe the larger um, CV would be on the chat if you wanted to look for other aspects of his work. And the topic of Persian Gulf is one of great interest to not only scholars of Persian studies, but Iranians as a whole. And we thank you very much, um, Professor Fromherz, for joining us to present your book. And I heard also that You had a fantastic class with our undergraduate students who were fired up with ideas and asked questions. And so thank you. That's really what this Yar Shatter series is about, to get the students engaged. So with without further ado, Majan, do you want to present a biography of Professor Fromherz so he can actually speak while we can hear from him?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm honored. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Allen James Fromherz is a professor of Middle East, Persian Gulf, and Mediterranean history. He directs the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University. His latest book, The Center of the World, A History of the Persian Gulf from the Stone Age to the Present, is published by University of California Press last year. He has published numerous books, including the Al-Mohads, The Rise of an Islamic Empire, Ibn Khaldun, Life and Times, and Qatar, A Modern History. He has also written several chapters in edited collections, including a chapter in A Companion to Islamic Granada. Dr. Fromherz has edited essay collections, including The Gulf in World History and Arabia at the Global Crossroads, and also co-edited two books, Knowledge, Authority, and Change in Islamic Societies, and Sultan Qaboos and Modern Oman. In 2022, Dr. Fromherz received a senior Fulbright scholarship to Granada, Spain, to write the biography of the poet and minister Ibn al-Khatib. Since 2024, he's also co-chair of the Monsoon Book Prize, which celebrates the archaeology and history and political economy of the Middle East and Indian Ocean world. Dr. Fromherz's biography is much longer and filled with many more accomplishments. But in the interest of time, I just shared the shortened version. I will leave the longer version in the chat box for you to read. Dr. Fromherz, my students and I enormously enjoyed your class and the thought-provoking lecture that you gave in my class. And I look forward to it. We are honored that you accept our invitation. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. And of course, I first want to thank the Roshan Center and its sponsors. I want to thank Tobin for your patience and for your technical knowledge and also for your work, which sounds fascinating. I got to chat with you a little bit about your work on the Ottomans. And I want to thank Fatima, Marjan, Ahmed, as well as everyone else who is here today. So I'm going to be sharing my screen first, of course, and I hope I can do this quickly and efficiently. There we go. Everybody see that, yes?
Yes.
Okay. I think you'll be happy because it sounds, because so many of you are fans of this man, Saadi Shirazi, that I start with him. I actually decided to change my PowerPoint to start with Saadi Shirazi and his famous poem, which is found also at the United Nations building quite famously. Ban Ki-moon, Obama have quoted this poetry. All men and women are to each other the limbs of a single body, each of us drawn from life's shimmering essence, God's perfect pearl. And when this life we share wounds one of us, all share the hurt as if it were our own. You who will not feel another's pain, you forfeit the right to be called human. Now, this poem is extraordinary and it fits so well with the ideals of centuries after the life of Saadi, right? So it's become this symbolic poem, as I mentioned before, at the UN, quoted by world leaders. And even Hegel said it's an example of pantheistic sentiment, right? But what I want to ask also is, where does this sentiment come from? Why is it there? Where, in what context does it emerge? And I think for that, we actually need to look at the Persian Gulf. We need to look at the Persian Gulf as this place of millennia of mixture, millennia of different cultural encounters, and millennia of cosmopolitan ethos. And that's part of the three main arguments that I make in this book. What I'm trying to do with the Persian Gulf is to apply what I learned as a Mediterraneanist to this other body of water. That is to use Brodell's famous arguments about long-term, medium-term, short-term change in history to understand the culture of the Gulf. And if we look at the geography of the Gulf, which is the key, as Brodell knows, to understanding the long-term history, we see that the Gulf is surrounded like a great fortification by mountains, marshes, and deserts. Around the entire shore of the Gulf, it is protected by God, in a sense, by geography, from the central powers which exist inside of the hinterland, farther away from the shore of the Gulf. And this is interesting because what it allows for is for the Gulf to remain effectively autonomous from those central powers, even though it remains very close to them at the same time. It's like a filtering system. And the Gulf is also highly connected through maritime, uh, through its maritime connections to the Indian Ocean, to the monsoon, and it's a type of slingshot in effect from the Mediterranean to India, and a net that also captures westward trade in the other direction. So these geographical features are important for understanding why the Gulf has been this cosmopolitan center for so long. The next is the cultural or religious or medium-term history. What I argue is that the Gulf shows us a different way of understanding this, what I consider false dichotomy between identity and cosmopolitanism, right? This is something that has come up even in our own times, right? Are you going to be loyal to your national identity, to your religion, or are you going to be loyal to a larger sense of humanity and understand that? Can you be distinctive but also be cosmopolitan? Or does being cosmopolitan mean that you give up all those aspects of your identity? What is interesting about the Gulf is that it shows that over the many millennia of this culture of interaction that is a part of the economic system of the Gulf, it is part of the determined geographical nature of the Gulf, there has been developed this idea of distinctive cosmopolitanism. So people maintain their distinctiveness even though they express cosmopolitan sentiments. I think that's something that was just being discussed, in fact, about Rumi, but also about Saadi Shirazi, right? They have this awareness of the other and this ethic of the other, even though they are grounded very much so in their Islamic, in the case of Saudi Shirazi, Sunni Islamic religious identity. And part of that also is the geography of the Gulf, because you have the hinterland, places like the Liwa Oasis, places like the shrines like Qom in Iran, and places like Riyadh and then Mecca in Arabia that allow people to reaffirm their distinctiveness, but then they go out into the Gulf and into the Indian Ocean, interacting with people from many different backgrounds at the same time. Okay, and then when it comes to political history, the Gulf also shows certain patterns, even in the Histoire événementale, as Brodell likes to call it, the history of events from year to year or day to day. What we see is that Gulf polities over time have been usually fiercely autonomous. Even if they paid some sort of tribute or token to an imperial power, they maintain that autonomy in order to allow for a high level of tolerance towards merchants of many different faiths, right? Because the main source of revenue for each of these port cities, and it is ports and trade that have dominated the Gulf economy, each the revenue, the source of revenue, comes from the number of merchants and the amount of merchandise that is coming through the port. So there is a direct incentive, both politically and economically, to behave in a certain way, sometimes against the directives of the central imperial power to which you pay tribute or to which you give nominal allegiance. Um, so we will see examples of this as we go on in my presentation. So here's the map that I used that we created um, for my book, and I just wanted to emphasize again sort of these three realms, these three geographical realms that surround the Gulf. Any of you who have been to uh, the Iranian side of the Gulf, you know about these incredible bandars. When I went to Musandam as well, it's like the fjords or the Norwegian coast, right? Uh, the access issues in terms of connection between the Gulf and the central lands is, I think, fascinating because it is difficult, but at the same time, that provides an opportunity for the ports to maintain a level of autonomy. The same is true of the marshes here, which effectively create an enormous moat between Basra and Baghdad, right? Dividing the two in a sense, but allowing Basra to exert a type of autonomy from the central influence of Babylon, or as it became later, Baghdad. In On the Arabian side, we have, of course, the vast Arabian desert preventing any central power coming from Arabia completely controlling this side of the Gulf. So you have basically the Gulf surrounded and filtered, and the geography allowing for these different major port cities to emerge. What's interesting about the history of the Gulf, too, is that it hasn't been always one place that has dominated as the major port. It's always moved around quite fluidly and quite freely. It's not like Rome, which became, or Jerusalem, which became, oh, this will be the central, the source of our power, even Istanbul. Instead, we have at different times different port cities emerging as kind of the main port of call for the Gulf, according to what situations exist in the larger world at the time. Because the Gulf is so dependent on world trade, that means the world intervenes in so many ways in the Gulf. Okay. One thing also that I try to emphasize to my students, and something that many people aren't necessarily aware of, but I think is immensely important, is that before the end of the 19th century, most of the world economy, 90% of the world's economy, according to economic historians, was agriculture, right? Putting things in the ground, getting peasants and serfs or people, even free laborers, to get the stuff out of the ground and provide some minimal surplus that could then go to the elite and finance literature, finance buildings, finance everything that we consider civilization. The last 10% is in commerce and trade in very high value goods across longer distances or between these agricultural centers. What's interesting about the Gulf is that it has been engaged in that smaller 10% of the economy for millennia, right? Today, that's what was the smallest part of the economy is now the largest part of the world economy, right? Everything is about services. Everything is about trade and exchange across vast distances. So what we have in the Gulf is actually an example of where we have been as a world in the last century, but extending back many millennia. So that's why I think also the Gulf can serve as a key to that longer history. So we go all the way back, in fact, to Dilmun, the wonderful and ancient civilization of Dilmun, which is mentioned in texts like Epic of Gilgamesh, and this place of the underground immortal waters, and from the beginning of world trade to the rise of Islam is my first chapter. And around 2800 BCE, we already see high value trade beginning to flow out of the Gulf on ships all the way to the Indus Valley and also connecting to Egypt as well. Um, and we see, despite the power of these emerging uh, empires like Sumer, Babylon, and even Persia, the Gulf maintains a level of autonomy and resists being directly controlled by these empires. Okay. Um, and even with the rise of Islam, which in many maps and many studies of the history of Islam, you just see, oh, the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate successors just took over everything, and the map changed color and everything was the same. In fact, we see the rise of really interesting uh, pagan, Christian, non-Sunni, non-Orthodox Muslim communities, anti-nominalists, as Ahmed Karim Mustafa is an expert in anti-nominalism, such as the Karmatians, who thrived on the Gulf shore, right? Even famously one time stealing the Kaaba and bringing it to the Gulf all the way from Mecca. So even very early on, if we look back to 2000 BCE, and this incredible tomb that I photographed when I was visiting Al Ain in the United Arab Emirates, we see already an example of this, uh, of how these merchant communities functioned even in 2000 BCE. We see an egalitarianism even in the way that of their burial practices, which I find fascinating. This notion of the ruler or the chief being a first among equals as well, but being in charge of making sure that the trade that goes through these routes is maintained. So, and that autonomy, of course, was also provided under the height of the great Persian and Hellenistic dynasties, such as the Seleucids. And the main thing that these autonomous rulers of, of the Gulf ports would present as an argument for why they shouldn't be directly controlled was basically the revenue from trade that they could provide in tribute to the emperor or to the ruler. So the king of Gera in eastern Arabia, which was the main caravan and also Persian Gulf maritime port, said to Antiochus, the Seleucid ruler, "Destroy not, O king, these two things which have been given us to the gods by the gods, perpetual peace and freedom. And if you do that, then you will destroy the wealth that we are giving you." And the ancient historians talk about the coast of the Gulf being thronged with cities and villages from which many ships set sail. So, and what's interesting as well is that even in these moments of great transition that are emphasized by historians of Islam and historians of the Arab conquest, we don't see the immediate change that is often expected. As many of you know, even the dirhams that were used in the first century were still depicting the Persian Shah, although with Arabic writing on them. But once we get to the 8th and the 9th century, we see the emergence of Basra as this new major port city of the Persian Gulf. And it's in Basra which becomes basically the cauldron in which Islam becomes a world religion from 632 to 1000 CE. And that's really the one of the main focus of this book, in fact, is the way that the Gulf, I argue, not Damascus, not Baghdad, not Medina or Mecca, but the Gulf, because of its connection to this wider world, to the Indian Ocean, is the key to understanding how Islam was transformed into not just a religion of the Arabs, but a religion potentially for anybody, right? Into a religion of the world. And Basra is famous for being this cauldron of Islam, this ancient milieu. And it's because of the trade that is coming in and out, and because of the peoples that are interacting on its streets. Basra is also where the Sufi tradition is first born, of course. Hassan of Basra and Rabia of Basra, um, but also Islamic humanism as well, and the Arabic lexicon and Arabic literature. All of this coming about because, not because necessarily of Arabs themselves, but oftentimes because of Malawi or those clients who have converted to Islam. In the beginning, most of them were Persians, of course. That extended, of course, to Turkomans, the Sindhis, to uh, people of the vast continent of South Asia, of India. Um, but it is this attempt to understand the Arabic culture from the outside that allows Arabic culture to become universalized as part of Islam. So we see that in even the works of the Maqamat of Al-Hariri, famously at the very end, Abu Zayd, our trickster, our friend who transforms into so many different roles, who is able to take on many different aspects of society and different cultures. He says, "Weep not for a friend that is distant, nor an abode, but turn yourself about with fortune as it turns. Consider all humanity your dwelling place, and imagine all the earth your home." And this, I think, is an extraordinary poetic moment because what Abu Zayd is doing, as many of you know, the very first lines of the Qasida poems of the that are hung that used to be hung upon the Kaaba and that are the basis for Arabic poetry always mention this notion of the abandoned campsite. But it's an abandoned campsite of a particular place and of a particular tribe and of a particular people. What we have here is Abu Zayd saying the abandoned campsite is not any particular place. It is all humanity, right? And that is, I think, an incredible nasib, as it's used in Arabic poetry. It's an incredible uh, uh, attempt to register in our memory and in our human empathy a larger sense of that human connection, which we already mentioned with uh, Shirazi's. So another example of Basra being this place of extraordinary melding of cultures is the use of is the extent to which trade connected all the way, of course, to China, and we the connection to China and Chinese trade is a whole nother interesting discussion. You had Basra merchants all the way in Canton until they were eventually driven out by a rebellion, etc. But what happened in Basra is that instead of giving up on that trade, they basically tried to mimic the very difficult porcelain manufacture and created bowls like this. So Chinese stoneware types uh, with this very intricate and beautiful depictions and calligraphy. Okay. One of the most interesting groups to emerge in Basra are the famous Brotherhood of Purity, or the Ikhwan al-Safa, which some of you I'm sure have heard of as well. They were a mysterious kind of secretive society. Most scholars today, looking at evidence from their collected works, have determined that they were probably mostly merchants and people who went trading in vast distances. And in their epistles, they write out all these uh, really incredible sentiments of a larger humanity in a way that it resembles the Hermetic tradition of perhaps medieval Italy and Renaissance Italy. So, in one of the epistles, by saying the world, the wise men mean the heavens, the earth, and all the creatures of them. And they called a macroanthropos because they think that it is a single body with all its spheres, the strata of its heavens, parts as if it is a part of a single human body. So this notion of humanism expands not simply to other humans, it transposes the human body onto the entirety of God's creation as well. So that's another even more extraordinary level of humanism, that not only is there a community of humans with whom we relate, but all of creation is in essence a reflection of the human body, right? And that I think is extraordinary because it's usually in the West, it's determined, oh, well, this is something that comes from a Vitruvian or classical tradition, that humanism really only emerged from the uh, Hellenistic tradition. But we see it articulated here in a very compelling way. Uh, Also, uh, there was a famous debate that was held, according to the Ikhwan al-Safa, between the king of the jinn, oh, no, between humans and animals, and it was adjudicated by the king of all the jinn, trying to justify why humans were in charge of all animals and why we had the right to use them as beasts of burden and even to eat them. And at the end, the only person who was able to convince the king of the jinn why humans should be treated differently from animals and why animals are at our service was a man who was learned, accomplished, worthy, king, pious, and insightful. But he was Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanif by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore, Christian in manner, from Damascus in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimations, regal in character, masterful in thought, and divine in awareness. So they're saying that in order to effectively represent all of humanity, you have to include all of these elements of all these different cultural uh, influences that are coming together in one place. This included also the sharing of religious shrines and sites. I think one of the most interesting being the shrine of Ezra or Al-Uzair, right? Here's Gertrude Bell, the famous British traveler, uh, her photograph of the site. Many of the Jews that existed in Iraq have left, of course, since the creation of the State of Israel. But in the 12th century, Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela uh, traveled to the Gulf all the way from the Iberian Peninsula, and he described Basra and these Jewish communities of merchants along the Gulf as being in the thousands, right? And as being extremely vibrant and important at the time. And what's interesting is to compare that with his description of the Jewish communities back in Europe and in the Mediterranean, which were only in the hundreds. But the emphasis is always so much on the Jewish history of the Mediterranean because that is where our Geniza documents often emphasize. But I think it's important not to forget that there was this incredibly vibrant and important Jewish community along the Gulf. 10,000 Jews, many rich men, 1,500 lived near the sepulcher of Ezra. And Muslims also erect a house of prayer out of their great love and veneration for him at the same time, and they, like the Jews on that account, and the Muslims come hither to pray. So we have that sharing of religious shrines that is very common in places like India today, but is considered extraordinary in the 20th century, unfortunately. A Jewish official controlled the pearl trade from Qatif near Bahrain, and the Jews believed that Qatif was this Havilah, this place mentioned in Genesis as well. So Basra eventually uh, sees its position as the center of Gulf trade. A famous traveler, Ibn Battuta, he visits Basra and he laments the decline of the intellectual tradition within Basra in the 14th century. And along with Basra is this incredible port of Saraf, right? Because one issue with Basra, as it existed in those marshes, is that it was very difficult before modern dredging equipment and to actually get a large ship up into the Tigris and Euphrates river system. You had to offload your ships in a deeper port, and then those went onto smaller ships, and then they were shipped into Basra, into the river system. So it's sort of like going from a sea where they ship into a river where they ship. And the place where that happened was Siraf, right, on the coast of what is now Iran. And Siraf also connected to Shiraz, where we have Saadi, right, of course. So Siraf was kind of this point of connection in the triangle between Shiraz and Basra. And Siraf also embodied uh, this cosmopolitan ethic discussed earlier. Um, and one way of showing this was, in fact, even in the literature of the Shahnameh. I have here Firdusi's parable of the ships of Shi'ism. This was kind of a preamble that was put in front of the Shahnameh in this version of the Shahnameh for Shah Tahmasp in 1530 to 1535. And it envisions all of humanity being divided up into the 70 ships of faith, following this notion that Muhammad declared there is around 70 or 73 different types of valid religion in the world, right? Shahrastani as well picked up on this idea in his book of religions and faiths. And these 70 ships were launched onto the Gulf and their sails raised. A single ship, of course, embellished like the Isle of the Rooster, is the ship with Muhammad and Ali. What I think is interesting about this tale is that it shows, of course, an awareness of these many different ships, of these different religions, but it's actually the inverse of what happened in reality on a day-to-day basis on these ships, which is that you had many people from many different faiths actually crowding in on the same ship. But it's being turned into this allegory of many different ships going from a single port. And I think it's emblematic of that important experience of rubbing shoulder to shoulder with people from very different faiths and traditions on the same ship. Also, the merchants who were in charge, effectively in charge of Saraf, right? They came together in councils and they decided things. And one of these was to be as welcoming as possible to foreign merchants, even if they came from very different religious traditions that caused them to be excluded. And one of these examples is from Suleiman the Merchant. He writes about this caste in India in which members do not eat at the same plate or the same table as those of other faiths because they see it as soiling them or as a type of defilement. When these Hindus come to Saraf and when one of our great merchants invites them to eat a meal with them, even if the meal is attended by 100 persons, he makes certain that each of these has their own plate and table, right? So what's extraordinary to me is that these from this caste are able to travel all the way to Saraf in comfort, but then that they're giving this particular and high level of toleration in this case. Okay. And another example, of course, is the man from Saraf who went for trade in the sea and stayed on the boat for 40 years. It never came to land. So there's this tradition of people truly having sea legs when they were from Saraf or al-Sarafi. Okay. The next port that emerges after Saraf and Basra, and there's this sort of gradual progression down the Gulf into the southeast of the Gulf, and then eventually to the very mouth of the Gulf to the Strait of Hormuz, is Hormuz Island, right? It used to be a settlement on the land, which is called Hormuz, but then confusingly, of course, there's an island also called Hormuz. This became the main center of the Portuguese Empire in this part of the Indian Ocean, but it was also an independent kingdom ruled by different rulers, by Persians, under a tribute system with the ruler, whichever ruler that might be, in the hinterland or in the central imperial power. So Hormuz, once it was captured by the Portuguese, at first you would think, oh, the Portuguese are going to impose the same sort of economic, religious, and political system and create the type of cultural changes that they tried to impose upon Brazil and Angola, right? That Hormuz would submit itself to Portuguese imperium and dominion. And because the Europeans, they have this ability to colonize so effectively that the era of the cosmopolitanism will be kaput, that it'll be finished with the coming of the Portuguese. When Albuquerque first came, you could say maybe that was going to happen because he was very harsh, famously punishing people with violence, etc. But what happened is that the Portuguese themselves, once they were established in Hormuz, they realized they're not getting any money from the small amount of date cultivation which was going on on the mainland. They were getting money from the customs house, which was this constantly flowing fountain of silver, is what they called it. And anything that they did, say like the Inquisition, to prevent people from coming to Hormuz and engaging in trade or staying over in Hormuz, was oftentimes a stopover point as they waited for the monsoon winds. Anything they did like that would prevent that revenue from flowing, not just to the people in charge, but also to the church, even to the choir boys, even to the organist, and to the priests and to the Augustinians. And so people became dependent on trade itself and on maintaining that level of toleration towards merchants of many different faiths within Hormuz. So what happens is that Hormuz actually shapes and compels the Portuguese to make changes and to tolerate differences more than it did in other parts of the Portuguese Empire, much more than it did in other parts of the Portuguese Empire. And even though the Portuguese leave a mark on the Indian Ocean culture more generally, Portuguese becomes a lingua franca in many respects. On the Gulf, what's fascinating about this period of Portuguese dominion or apparent dominion is how little of an influence it actually leaves compared to Brazil, compared to Goa. And all of their fortifications that are built up along the Gulf, not only were they easily avoided and pirates sort of thrived around them, but they become themselves the centers of a new empire that is homegrown. And this empire is the empire of the Omanis, who end up replacing the Portuguese. So even though the Portuguese introduced fort architecture, major water cisterns, cannons, guns, naval artillery techniques, they are all just sort of taken over by Gulf powers, including this first, I would argue, first really homegrown Gulf empire in Oman. Okay, so religious diversity existed in Hormuz. There's some really interesting examples of this. There was a Christian who once dressed like an Indian and he bought from a huntsman some birds to eat at home, but the huntsman, believing he was in fact an Indian who wished to make a charitable offering by freeing the birds, released the birds into the sky, and the Christians started to shout. And when the huntsman was informed how he had been misled, he not only lost the birds, but he had to return his money to the Christian. All the people around started laughing. I think this is a really interesting story. First of all, you have a Christian, for some reason, dressed as a Hindu, right? You have this merchant who thinks he knows what he's supposed to do in the circumstance. It's the complete opposite. And then you have this audience as well that is aware of these sort of humorous encounters across theistic divides, right? Um, and even, I think, really important example of this sort of sharing across identities and different cultures is when people find their last resting place next to people of a very different faith as well. When Buddhists, Moors, Gentiles, and Jews all are mixed together in the same cemetery, that I think is also an extraordinary signal. That's what happened in Hormuz. But eventually, they're saying the Omanis, sort of under the shadow of the British Empire as well, but very much having their own autonomous maritime empire, spread out and take over all of these Portuguese forts all the way down the African coast, and really establish this extraordinary maritime empire that I think diverts from the assumptions of the Great Divergence, which says that Europeans' power is inexorably rose at the expense of non-Europeans in all cases. In fact, I see the Omanis with their Banyan, these are the Indian merchants and traders who defeated the Portuguese in 1650, actually took advantage of the situation in ways that enhanced their empire. And what we see with the British, even in their relationship with the Persian Gulf, is very interesting as well, because they never wanted to rule it directly. And the British did not create this kind of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial tripart division that we find in other parts of the British Empire. It was a protectorate, not a direct colonization. And what does that mean? The British wanted to identify particular rulers from particular tribes that just happened to be the prominent ruler at the time that they are identified in the treaties, the maritime treaties in the 19th century, as responsible for piracy, as responsible for the safety of their ships moving, especially from Basra to Bombay. One of the main instigations for this was not just that that money and goods were being captured by pirates. It was the fact that women were starting to travel from Britain all the way to India. And with the steamships and even before the steamships with the great age of sail, the British wanted to ensure that their women felt safe as they passed through the Persian Gulf. So it was in fact that which I think which is not really emphasized in previous histories that I've looked at, that instigated this outcry against the so-called piracy and led to this strategy of creating protectorates that then turn out in the end to be these ruling families that today are the wealthiest people in the world and in control of vast resources due to their investments of their oil wealth. So Muscat, it was taken from Portugal, in fact, by the Muslims, but also by the Hindus at the same time. And I think that's also really interesting. And one thing from living in Muscat for a couple of years that you see is this enduring influence of Hindu in Indian culture. And there's even Hindu sheikhs, right, within the consultative councils or the Diwan. And the minister of religion, who's actually the one who sponsored the Monsoon Book Prizes that I'm in charge of with my co-director, Abdurrahman Al-Salami, he deliberately changed the name of the ministry from the Ministry of Islamic Affairs to Religious Affairs to reflect that he was representing people of all religions within Oman, not just Muslims and not just Ibadis, right? Okay, so after the British and after this Omani Empire, after Muscat begins to decline when it is severed from Zanzibar, we have eventually the rise of the new global port cities of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary opportunity. Most symbolized, I think, for our students, the one place that they would know would be Dubai, right? Uh, Doha is beginning to, I think, compete with Dubai, also even Abu Dhabi, perhaps. But the current success of places on the Arabian shore now, like Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi, was never foreordained. It it resulted from strategic investment by development-minded rulers and their allies, but also this long-term cultural um, system, right? And this long-term uh, understanding of international trade and commerce and of zones of free duty zones as well. Um, Also, what's interesting is that these Arab Gulf rulers usually maintain their legitimacy by extending their tribal network and using development as a way to distribute income and opportunity within that network, but exporting the anomie or the problems that often come up with modernization that is often borne by expatriate workers, usually large numbers of single men coming from South Asia, right? And there's a lot of ethical questions and issues and humanitarian issues that come with this, but that is how they have squared the circle, in essence, of being very cosmopolitan and modern, while also being able to assert and maintain a very distinctive category for themselves in their citizenship, right? So when you go to Qatar, you go to the Emirates, you realize only 10% of the population, for example, in Qatar is actually Qatari, right? So is this a cosmopolitan model, or is it actually an exclusive model? Or is it both at the same time? And that's what I think is interesting about the Gulf, is you see both sides of that coin. We see the persistence of monarchy in the Arabian Gulf. Unlike, of course, in Iran, where the monarch was taken out in 1979, on the Arabian side, they were afraid that might happen to them, but it has not. And one of the questions that uh, political scientists of the Arabian Gulf have been asking really ever since the 1980s is, why have these monarchs persisted so well in the midst of this economic diversification and extraordinary growth? Why has this monarchical model continued to be persistent and has not fallen as was predicted by most development economists? And I think part of it is, as I was explaining earlier, this creation of a citizen elite and then an exporting of the problems of modernization and its physical costs on others, right? But also this extraordinary foresight and investment in things like the dredging of ports to create the largest port in the world, even before you even knew that you would be one of the most significant ports in the world. Creation of Jebel Ali, Port Dubai. Here's Queen Elizabeth II visiting Jebel Ali, Port Dubai. They thought, oh, this would never fill up. You know, this is an extraordinary dream that this huge port would actually be used. It was filled up within a matter of a decade or so, and they had to build an even bigger one. This is how it works with Dubai. What's interesting, though, is that there are certain tensions that I think are mitigating against the continued boom times or the continued growth. And that Dubai, kind of like Saraf and other port cities that in the past were sort of the center of commerce and effectively the center of power, in the end, it changed and shifted to other places. And I think one of the threats for the future of the Gulf is the rise of national uh, of nationalism and the rise of these new divisions, even within the Arab Gulf states themselves. So the famous Qatar blockade, when Qatar was blocked off from the rest of the world by its neighbors and a set of demands was given to it, the constant issues surrounding the Iran nuclear program and the connection with between the Gulf and what is going on in Gaza and Israel. All of these, I think, are potential threats to the current prosperity of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and to their potential power. And that is why I think they see the United States as basically the most important be all and end all ally that assures that the Gulf maintains this kind of unique status. And that's one thing that the United States has done is with the Carter Doctrine and with the notion of balancing different powers, has effectively continued that geographical protection that has existed historically, even as airplanes and ships have become more advanced and have plowed through those geographical barriers. It is the United States that ever since the Desert Storm has assured the national boundaries and barriers and prevented the Gulf from being dominated by one particular imperial power. So that, I think, is one of the interesting aspects of the Gulf today is that not only is there this geography of cosmopolitanism, but there is a doctrine now of maintaining that geography of cosmopolitanism for the benefit of the United States itself, right? With the Carter Doctrine. So where will the Gulf be, though, if the United States actually withdraws? I don't think the United States is going to effectively withdraw, even though has been threatened many times, pivot towards Asia, etc., because it can't. Politically, I think it's impossible due to the huge spike in oil prices that would happen if the United States were to completely withdraw from the region. So in the long term, if oil no longer becomes a driving factor in American interests, perhaps the Gulf will need to look to other neighbors. And I think one of these might be India, one of these might be other significant powers, or even other regional powers and influences, such as China, which is growing in its influence as well. So thank you so much. It was, for me, writing this book was about answering a really deep question that I've always had. When I was a young boy in church, I would often ask these really awkward questions like, so why are we being given the opportunity of salvation, but not other people who have not ever heard of Christ, So, and the priest will be like, why are you asking that question? That's so silly. But I think it comes to that. And I think, how do people live within a world of strangers? How do you have sort of universal ideals, or even universalism that comes from within your particular background or religious ethic, but then also understand your connection to a larger human ideal as well. And I think in the Gulf, we've seen that struggle happening with that question happening over and over again over many millennia, and not just something that's a recent question. And that's why I think the Gulf is so fascinating and so interesting, is that it's sort of this testing ground for cosmopolitanism and distinctiveness across a whole spectrum, as opposed to being an either or question. So thank you all for your time, and it was a pleasure being here with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Fromherz. I think you have introduced quite a few things that put questions on, on people's minds to come forth. I know Marjan Jun, you are taking care of that, so let me put my hand up as one of the questions, but I'll wait for others.
Now we don't have any question. You can go first, and then I can. I also
Okay.
have.
Okay. By the way, I just hear a lot of festivities going on outside the building we live in, so I hope that doesn't bother you guys, but um, with my mic open. Professor Fromherz, I mean, there are lots of things on my mind. One is that I think, or do you agree with that what you presented as making the Gulf so lively and continue to prosper would be what we could in fact define as soft power? That, it seems like the current views, at least in some countries, including our own, is to think in terms of more domination and control as opposed to having these levels of soft power when you attract people or because you understand them, because you provide the tools, because you educate and things like that. This is one of my questions. And the other one is, how well is the Gulf and the situation really presented in the study of the region? Did you find that there are a lot of things that have not been talked about? So I just let you take it from there.
Very good questions. Yes, when it comes to soft power, it's interesting because in the end, really the hard power is ultimately provided by the United States. As much as these Gulf states might invest in some of their own military, it's largely to keep American political interests happy, especially arms dealers and manufacturers. But I think the soft power is very much also tied to the economy and to investment and to the main reason why many people end up going to the Gulf for those extraordinary opportunities, even those single men with desperate circumstances who end up working on the construction sites within the Gulf, sometimes in very difficult conditions. They're doing that with the promise of something that the Gulf appears to be presenting, which is this extraordinary opportunity of wealth in the world that isn't really seen as much in many other places. I think the fact that the citizen population is so small, in fact, allows an opening, in essence, for people from other backgrounds to fill many aspects of that economy and of that boom that they would not have been able to fill if the citizen population were much larger. But it also, of course, ties people to the ruler or to their sponsor who brings them to that country. So is that soft power? I think there is the soft power element as well. Of course, there's Al Jazeera, there's the media. They've become masterful at kind of presenting the forum or being the forum in which all these conversations are happening. The most extraordinary event I attended when I was living in Qatar in 2008 was sponsored by Sheikh Moza, who's the wife of the Emir Hamid. And it was on the Quran. And the createdness of the Quran, the nature of the Quran. One of these questions, of course, that in the past, in the 9th century, led to the minna, or the division of the Islamic world. It almost caused the collapse of the caliphate, if you read some theological histories. But she created this conference, and she brought people from both extremes of the conversation. We had Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and then you had Tariq Ramadan, um, and you had agnostic and even atheistic points of view being presented. And she allowed all of these, but it was about having the forum itself, of being in control of that. Um, and I think that's emblematic of the soft power, that we are going to be the new intellectual center of for and cultural center, allowing these sorts of exchanges and new ideas to emerge.
Thank you.
If I may, I ask my question, and I wrote it down for the sake of clarity. Dr. Fromherz, thank you so much for the engaging talk. As I said, it was thought-provoking in my class and here. So my question is that in what ways does the book and its historical framing of the Persian Gulf as a dynamic center of cultural, economic, and political exchange invite comparisons with other maritime regions that are historically positioned as centers, such as the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean?
That's a great question. I think the comparison between the Gulf and these other maritime centers is that the Gulf, at least geographically, it's quite small, of course, in comparison to the Mediterranean, or the Indian Ocean, of course, which is this vast kind of world ocean and space, or the Atlantic. But as I mentioned in my talk, it's been incredibly hard to control, even though you would think that it could be easily this Babylonian lake, or Arabian or Persian. It's never been completely Persian or completely Arabian or completely Babylonian. It's always been a world of its own and connected to the larger world. And that's really the argument that I'm making. It's this global sea. The Mediterranean, though, in its history, has always, I think, referenced those centuries when it was the Mare Nostrum, when it was a part of the Roman Empire, right? And this constant attempt to revive that history, even among later conquerors, even among, of course, the Ottomans, of course, always referred to even the Roman emperors and their predecessors as well. With the Gulf, you don't have that, which I think is interesting. You don't have either the creation of a successful, at least non-ancient Persian navy. The Persians do not create a successful navy. And that's one of the biggest military historical questions that can be asked. But I think it's also emblematic of this sort of special status that the Gulf has had over the centuries.
Thank you. Bobin, please.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fromherz, for this really fascinating talk and over this huge time scale. And I think what I'd like to ask about is that this really is a incredibly impressive amount of both time and space that you've covered here, from the Bronze Age up to the present day, and from the Arab Gulf into Iran and Central Asia and so on. And so I guess my question is, how did you approach handling a project of this scale? Like, did you conceive of it like this from the beginning? How did you go about deciding what to incorporate, what not to incorporate? And if you could speak to that a little bit, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Um, I really started thinking about the potential of this project after I wrote my history of Qatar, because I was asked by the editor to do it. He said, "We don't have any real histories of Qatar. I think it would sell well. It would be a great opportunity." Ivy Tourist, I don't know if you know Iraj Bakrzadeh. He's the publisher in London. he and his editor, Lester Cook, came to me and said, "Oh, you should write about Qatar." And when I saw in my research about Qatar when I was living there in 2007, 2008, is that really there's this wide vista of opportunity to write these histories that hasn't been, uh, that many of these histories have not been written, especially in this sort of synthetic way. Instead, what you see is sort of this division between there's a Persian versus an Arab version of the history. The sea itself doesn't get the attention necessarily outside of the sort of conflictual, distinctive histories. And I wanted to kind of look out from the sea as opposed to from the empire in, um, and write that kind of inverted history. I have written in histories of empires in the past, so about history of the Almohads, for example, and their rise. And I wanted to try and see things from the point of view of this space that is almost at the antithesis of central control. Um, but yeah, it came about in 2013 as well when I was in Oman on a Sultan Qaboos fellowship. And then in 2016, that's when I really had the book proposed. I went on a fellowship to Abu Dhabi with the NYU Humanities Center, which I highly recommend to you, Tobin, in fact, and to anybody who's here to apply for their fellowships, especially as NEH is drying up. You should apply for the NYU Abu Dhabi Humanities Fellowship. And that really allowed me to travel around this space and understand this incredible diversity and also the ancient nature of that diversity, that it's not just, an exceptional case here and there, but that's been going on for such a long time. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think the burning question, or as some would put it, the elephant in the room, is that you have your book presented at the History of the Persian Gulf.
Yes.
So, it's, I mean, Iranians are very happy about that. Because that's the way it has, they're always looking at finding the earliest historical document that, that this
Yes.
could be referred to. So was there a particular reason why you thought that that would be a better kind of reference to it? Or because it established the historical background? Or
Yeah, I mean, if I had my complete freedom of choice in terms of whether if I had everything the way I wanted it to be, I would say it should be called the global Gulf, right? It is really this global space. And
okay, the global Gulf. Okay.
And it's a combination, of course, of Arab and Persianness. And that's something that really comes out from living there. And there's a sense among both Arabs and Persians of being Khaliji, which is distinct from other aspects of their Arab and Persianness.
Yeah, right. Right.
Some of that, unfortunately, is starting to be erased, right? So an example of this is the Bastakia neighborhood, which is no longer called Bastakia, even though most of the people came from Bastak in Iran and were Arabs who then migrated over to Dubai, and they've changed the name, right? So that it doesn't have an Iranian influence.
Yeah.
And I think there's examples of this in Iran as well, where the Arab Sunni population, or even sometimes the Arab Shia population, is facing discrimination or issues. In fact, during the Cyrus the Great celebration, there was some issues with that. And I think it's becoming, even though we see ourselves in this, we're in a cosmopolitan era, more and more, I think there's this emphasis on the distinctiveness that is problematic. Now, the Persian Gulf, I'm very happy with the Persian Gulf because, as you say, it's one of the oldest references is in the Greek documents that we have and earlier documents is to Sinus Persicus. And I think it can still embody, even when it's called the Persian Gulf, because of the fact that the Persians, as I mentioned earlier, didn't create that kind of complete naval domination that the Romans did. Ironically, it's not called the Roman Sea, it's called the Mediterranean. But if any sea could be called one, it would be the Mediterranean. So I think um, that's my kind of convoluted answer. I guess it depends on the day. I'm very
Right.
happy
No,
with
no, I get, yeah. Thank you.
yes.
Thank you.
Jane, please.
Throughout your talk, you described a lot of references to having lived and researched in various cities on the Arabic side of the Gulf. I wonder, have you lived or done extensive research on any of the cities on the Persian side of the Gulf?
Yes, I wish I were able to have that opportunity. Unfortunately, as you know, there aren't as many funding opportunities or the ability to uh, make your way over there, even the permission when I was in Qatar to go to Iran. Um, I did focus the two of my core chapters, one on Siraf and then the other on Hormuz. Um, so that I think you can't understand, as mentioned earlier, you can't understand the history of the Gulf without that crucial realm, which is the Persian realm, and then but you also have to include the Babylonian and the Arabian side of the Gulf as well. And it's a combination of those three, and I tried to balance all three of those influences. Now, admittedly, I'm not as much of a specialist uh, on the Persian side, but I think it'd be very hard to find someone who is equally as specialized in all of those realms. Now they do exist. I think Ahmed Karam Mustafa, for example, and other extraordinary scholars. I humbly submit to any sort of help or criticism or any sort of revision or suggestions that people might have um, in that regard, and I would be happy to include further examples or further ways of highlighting that Persian element. Because I think, and I think even in my Dil Moon chapter, it's not only about those particular ports. For example, I open with those particular ports, but I also talk about the larger world historical milieu. And I spend a lot of time on the influence, for example, of Cyrus the Great, for really establishing this notion of a universal empire and that having a lasting kind of influence on this notion of universalism more broadly. So yes, you could, I think, accurately make that statement that it's definitely possible to focus even more on the Persian side, but I think it also has to be a balance of many of those three main cultural realms.
If I may just have a quick follow-up on that, Jane, I was very surprised, almost shocked, when I realized that our graduates of Persian Studies, who are highly capable of speaking to people in Persian, had not been communicating with the Iranians. And the answer usually was that they're not allowed to. And I had automatically assumed that the not allowed belongs to the Islamic Republic of Iran until I discovered that it's one of the conditions of the general, what's the word for it? The sanctions. The American sanctions. I don't know how that applies to university professors, but the American sanctions forbid students from including direct conversations by Iranians in their scholarship. That really shocked me because, and I think, I mean, I don't know what sort of issues Professor Fromherz faced, but it is sad that, you know, these kinds of political conflicts come in, and there may have been on both sides, but in this particular case, I was surprised to find that out. But I think we should let Professor Kar Mustafa maybe has his closing remarks, and maybe in some cases he would address some of these issues that came up. But it's lovely to see you with us, Jane, and we look forward to have you in future events here.
I'm honored that you came, Jane. I'm a fan of your work. So
Yes.
thank you.
Oh, you are muted, Jane. Yeah.
I'm just being introduced now to your work. I didn't know about your work till now, and so I'm grateful to Fatemeh and Ahmad for introducing you, and for the Your Shatter lecture series for sponsoring your lecture.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to all of you who already asked some questions. I just wanted to make a few comments in terms of placing this kind of a scholarly project into its historiographical context, so to speak. Ultimately, of course, we're looking at a broader attempt on the part of historians of the late 20th century and the 21st century to break out of the confines of nationalistic historiographies, which had set the pattern for many decades before then, especially the first half of the 20th century. And this has taken many different forms. And Brodell's Mediterranean emphasis, of course, also is one of those. It could be seen in that way of breaking out of any other kinds of prisms and see the Mediterranean as a whole and study it in its breadth and depth, so to speak. Others have been responding to it by feeling the pressure, for instance, to globalize their perspectives. As Ellen, who's in a history department, would know, it has taken the form of, let's say, not just modernists, of course, who see themselves as sort of naturally globalists, or study of globalism, which has taken the form of transnationalism, but also early modernists and medievalists. And there has been, over the past 5 years, a call for global medievalism. And then ancient historians of Rome and Greece have also opened up to this global call. So it takes the form of globalization and the study of globalization. Oftentimes, at the end of the process, you end up thinking about, all right, how could we possibly actually deal with the complicated issues of breaking out of nationalist confines? One particularly good way of going about it is precisely perhaps what, Ellen, in your book you have attempted, which is picking out a particular region which clearly has its place in the larger stories of its hinterlands, Iran, the Mesopotamia, which has been Iranian and Iraqi and Arab and Islamic and all that, and the Arabian Peninsula, and not to mention, of course, its mouth to the Indian Ocean and Oman and all the rest. But you demonstrate that the region itself has its own specific history, which is at the same time local and global. Now, finding such regions probably is not always easy, but they are there. Mediterranean being one. In the case of Iranian history, Khorasan the gateway to Central Asia, the rest of Asia, to China being another one, for instance, very, very capable. So I think what is compelling about this is the fact that you not only found the region, but you also found the fact that it, as a maritime entity, its complexity has to do with trade and the presence of many traders. And so it's the focus being trade, and then led you also to the theme of cosmopolitanism, which you could also trace in time in that particular region, and humanism, if you will. So I think those are the benefits and the contributions of this kind of a perspective. Getting back to the question of what is Iranian about this, what is Arab about this, and all that, I think it goes to highlight the fact that what we consider the modern nation state, whether in the case of Iran, of course, it's Iran, the Iranian side is dominated by the single state, whereas the Arabian side, so to speak, in the modern period is fragmented into different entities, obviously. The whole point, I suppose, is that those nation states should be well aware of the fact and sensitive to the fact that they are composed of different regions, which have their own long-standing histories and identities. Khaliji, in this case, being one for Iran, obviously. So I think in hindsight, I think what we can say about this focus is that it highlights the significance of focusing in on what often we sometimes in passing call regional identities, which are so very important in the story of the national culture, broadly speaking. So I think that's how it sits with the study of Iran, and it sensitizes us to the fact that the Khaliji regions of Iran have always had their own kind of integration or lack thereof into the broader Iranian history. And all that needs to be picked up with closer studies. I was thinking, and I will end with this was the kind of thing that I was thinking about. Another prism to look at the Gulf is through that of language, obviously. And when you mention cosmopolitanism, that's another big story. I mean, the story of the Mediterranean is inextricably tied to Arabic and Latin, and then the emergence of vernaculars from the 13th, 12th century onwards. Persian Gulf, we could also probably try to take a linguistic shot at things and how it all develops. What would it be really cool, and how that could work out. But that's a different project. Anyway, the whole point is cosmopolitanism, humanism has its own other interesting literary dimensions which you draw out. But that's it. My comments is that my overwhelming comment is that the particular focus has a lot to contribute to our understanding of even such overtly nationalistic, debates about, is it the Persian Gulf? Is it the Arabian Gulf? It actually has a lot to demonstrate and a lot to contribute to the fact that, well, these are regions of their own which have their particular kind of integration into the story of the modern national state. And we should be forever aware of that and be sensitive to that. So I enjoyed it very much. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to, put this into the broader context of the kind of an attempt that makes a lot of sense from a historical perspective. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, all of you. Professor Fromherz, it was really fantastic. It was wonderful, particularly the way you brought in the humanism and the literary dimension of the humanism into the conversation. I want to add two quick points. One is that with this identity of Khaliji, one is that right now, as we speak, there's a huge festival going on in the Bandar of Bushehr, which is an annual thing and brings thousands and thousands of the youth from across Iran there to listen to Khaliji music and dance and all kinds of cultural festivities, which fortunately right now have the support of the current existing system. And so they managed to do this year after year. I also remembered as you were talking about the Khaliji identity that it is so well woven into the broader Iranian identity. For example, there is a whole Khaliji fashion of design, of makeup, of all kinds of and I'm sure that my colleague Marjan, if we had more time, could speak to all kinds of theatrical, because that's her specialty, aspects of the Khaliji cultural experience. But of course, you cannot bring in all those aspects, but it has really made me think about the fact that these identities of the Khalijis, as diverse as it is, as global as it is, but at the same time, it's very deeply rooted in Iran and kind of constantly comes to the surface in the shape of all kinds of cultural practices. So I think on that note, Dr. Musavi, if you didn't want to add anything else, and thank you for
joining us.
Yeah, and thank you for taking Professor Fromherz to your class, and I'm sure they benefited from it. And as I told you, this recording will also become a source of learning for long time to come, I'm sure. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Sundays, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much. Yes.